everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Brown Bag Lecture Series this month of September. As you are probably all aware, I'm Dr. Nathan Ty in the History Department at UNK and the organizer of our lecture series here at the Public Library. And as always, we want to extend our deepest thanks to the librarians and the staff here at Kearney Public Library for making this such a welcoming space for us to kind of share what we're doing on campus, what our students are doing on campus, and just the rich history that we spend all our time with. We have a couple of talks coming up now through the fall. So in October, it will be They Held the Laboring Oars, the Frank Family's Civil War. So we're going to do a double header on kind of the Frank family and things related to the G.W. Frank Museum. That will be, I will be giving that talk. And then in November, on November 12th, Lena Homburger-Cordia from the History Department, as well as the Trails and Rails Museum, will be talking about Ned Dunlap and his ship unraveling a mystery, which will actually be a little bit of a homecoming. For those of you who would remember the library before its remodel, there were those dusty ships on the top of the shelves down on the first floor. Lena's been spending a lot of time with those ships and kind of piecing them back together, and why exactly we had a couple of hand-carved ships collecting dust on the shelf in the public library for a great many couple of generations. But today we are happy to welcome, again, a frequent contributor and speaker to our series, April White, the director of the G.W. Frank Museum at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. She's also the board president of the Nebraskan Museums Association, and then also was recently elected to the board for the Mountain Plains Museums Association, which is the overarching kind of institutional support for museums across the region. She holds degrees in art history and American history, and continually shares her skills and years of museum experience through mentoring UNK student interns, the graduate assistants, and volunteers at the museum, hosting workshops, and by sharing history through our community through presentations like the one we'll have today. And so with that, April.
Okay, all right. Can everybody hear me okay? Everybody all right? Awesome. Turn it up? Okay, let me, yeah, I should be able to do that.
No, not on that.
Oh, okay. Testing. Can everybody hear me? Okay, is that better? Does it need to go up more? You can go up more if you need us to. All right, we're good. Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Ty, for the introduction today. And thank you all for being here. I'm very excited about today's topic that we're going to talk about. I am the director of the G.W. Frank Museum of History and Culture here in Kearney. Most of you may be more familiar with it as the Frank House or even the Stone House, all the way back to the days of when it was a tuberculosis hospital. But either way, it's a thriving on-campus museum today. We do tons of different work, but we try to explore all the avenues of the house's history and stuff, because it is technically, in its identity, a Gilded Age mansion, but it's also served multiple different purposes and had lots of different influences outside of its own walls. And so today we're going to talk about how that house and the people who built it really contributed to Kearney's first electricity, its very first electrical implementation throughout the city. And how that then became, helped Kearney become a growing and thriving city, and then how it actually helped the state of Nebraska become significant within United States electrical history, actually. And basically just how this implementation almost 150 years ago, and this vision for an electric Kearney 150 years ago really kind of brought about the city we know today, and how electricity obviously is very much here to stay. It's not going anywhere, and if anything, it's just increasing even more. But it all started somewhere. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't develop out of nothing. It really has a really interesting history right here, maybe just a couple miles from where we're sitting right now, which is pretty exciting. So without further ado, an introduction, When we think of electricity, like when somebody says electricity, like what do you think of? My thoughts usually go to like maybe electrical currents, or a lot of us think of like light bulbs is a big one, household appliances, things like that. It's pretty much in everything nowadays. It is literally on us all the time. It is in all kinds of different forms. It literally helps keep us alive in some cases. It operates large buildings down to even like the smallest like studio apartments. It's literally in everything. And this whole building even that we're in is just full of it. This presentation that I'm giving you right now that we are looking at on the screen is happening because of electricity. And it very much is a huge implement. And I came across this photo and it's really interesting because it's kind of twofold. One, it really shows like the large kind of impact of electricity. This is taken from outside the International Space Station in about 2009. But the space station, I mean, we go from no electricity in the early 1800s to literally within 200 years, we are flying around in outer space because of electricity in front of large cities. And so, I mean, even in our own brains, it's literally happening right now. As you are consuming this information and listening to my words, your brain is sending electrical charges in your head and converting what I'm saying into actual understandable language. Pretty exciting. All of these neurons firing all the time. And we're all experiencing it together, which is very exciting. And so you have to try and imagine with electricity being this prevalent in the world, in our everyday lives all the time, it's hard to imagine what it would be like without it, like without electricity at all. It's very difficult for us to imagine. I know I take it for granted all the time, but it's very difficult for us to imagine. So the question then is like, why should we care about it? Why should we care about the history of it? And especially, why is Kearney's electrical history significant? Well, you could go on and a bunch of different reasons, but basically, we live here in Kearney. Many of us live here or in the area, or have lived here, or have ties here somewhere, so it affects us directly. Kearney's electrical history affects us directly. Nebraska's very first hydroelectric power plant was actually built here in Kearney. The very first hydroelectric power plant in the entire state was built here in Kearney and still operates even today. And then one of the more longer, larger, lasting significant effects is that Kearney's hydroelectric power plant, that very first one in Nebraska, is one of the main reasons why Nebraska is the only state in the entire United States with 100% publicly owned power today. We are the only state in the entire United States where the public owns the power. It's not privatized by private companies and things like that. So the question is like, again, this is all obviously significant and important, but how do we begin to even like understand and explain why this is significant? As historians, we always love that. We always love the why. We love to think about the why and think about, we like the who, what, where, all that kind of stuff too, and the facts, but we love delving into like interpreting the why. Like, why is it significant? Why should any of us care? And so, also like a lot of us historians and people who know me, know that I love to go all the way back to the beginning of things when people ask me questions, and when people, it's kind of a joke where if you ask April, what time is it? I'll be tempted to tell you the origination of the clock. Like, it's just how it is. And it's so fun though. It's really fun to go back to the beginning and be able to really understand that context and development and the why. And so this is Kearney in 1876. This is a map of Kearney. I know it's kind of hard to see, but this is pretty much it. This is obviously a drawing, because photography obviously did not really exist in the state that we recognize it today. And of course, aerial photography definitely did not exist, so this is definitely a drawing interpretation, but it's pretty accurate for who did it at the time. So this is Kearney in 1876 before electricity. This red plus sign or X right here, this is Central Avenue right here. This is downtown Kearney. And then this is Central Avenue, and this is basically 25th Street or Highway 30 today. And so if we zoom in a little bit, you can kind of see like the horse and buggies, little dinky, little houses and stuff. If we're looking at this again, this is Central Avenue right up here, 25th Street. So Mona is going to be showing up right about here in about, oh, would that be like 30 years? Something like that, 25, 30 years. The World Theater is right here. This building actually is still there, right there. But it kind of gives you an idea of like how sparse it is and how just, it's a city and people live here and there are buildings and all kinds of stuff, but this is before electricity. So before electricity existed, people really had to kind of stay in a centralized area because they couldn't get too far away from the main resources and stuff because there was no real way to get to them. And so a lot of people just kind of stayed here. And so my theory is that Kearney likely would not have expanded much beyond this if electricity had never been harnessed and introduced on a wide scale. And so the question then is like, how does Kearney go from this to what we know it today? Because obviously it doesn't look like this anymore. We don't run, you know, it's just, I mean, it's so, it almost looks like Monopoly, like little Monopoly houses and stuff. So how does it go from this to what we know it today? And it basically starts in the early to mid 1800s when people first started harnessing the power of electricity and being able to implement it into ways that can actually benefit our lives and things like that. So once it was discovered, once these discoveries were made, the 1800s was a huge time of just development, discovery, invention, all kinds of trial and error, scientific observation, all kinds of different stuff, basically known as the Industrial Revolution. And during this time, electricity really just kind of exploded onto the scene. And it was electricity that literally powered the Industrial Revolution. And so once they figure out how to harness this seemingly very scary, erratic, kind of very intimidating, awe-inspiring power, they really start to implement it immediately in many, many places as they can. So in the United States, the very first forms of electricity that became widespread were communication. Communication was the first. That was the first one, is people wanted to be able to transmit information between each other as best as they could. And so they used electricity on telegraphs. Telegraphs were the main ones that they used. And then eventually these would be converted into telephone poles and stuff like that. But there's some places in the United States you can still find some of these original telegraph poles. And so the wires basically, and I will fully admit, I do not fully understand how electricity works. No idea. I feel like it's simple but also complex kind of thing. But basically, power is generated and then it travels through wires and then that electricity can then be implemented into other stuff. Very quickly though, we're talking like less than 40 years, like 30 to 40 years, in the grand scheme of human experience, it becomes pretty much everywhere. The earliest forms of these, basically it was like everybody had their own line that would go directly into their house. It's not like today where there's one big line of wires and then they split out as they go along. It was literally one line would be directly linked to your house all the way to like wherever the power station was. And so it ended up with tons and tons of wires all over the place. And as with anything, as these became more and more prevalent and realized these were here to stay, any sort of new development, new technology is always met with a slight amount of like unsure, confusion, and even fear. And so there was a lot of backlash against the early implementation of electricity, where there were these political cartoons that were coming out in magazines and newspapers that were warning about the scary effects of electricity, that you might get sucked up into all these wires, and my goodness, and the horses won't be able to handle it, and they'll just faint dead away, and you'll have to run for cover. Or they tried to make themselves feel safe, and they came up with these conceptual ideas of these full contained outfits that you could wear that would keep you perfectly safe from all the wires and electricity and stuff like that. So granted, none of this ended up, I don't go walking around outside like this. I will not judge anybody who does, because I understand that, everybody has their own way of doing things. But Obviously nowadays we realize that when done correctly, electricity can be very safe and very effective. But this is usually pretty common with any sort of new technology. Like for example, nuclear power. That was one when it first started coming around and some of the long-term ill effects became apparent. It became very, very scary. But despite these fears, electricity becomes 100% mainstream, as we obviously know it today. So here's like, just a few years later, into 1910, this is Times Square. So this is the Flatiron building right there in the center, and Times Square, which will eventually build itself up into kind of the more familiar image we know today. But this is all electricity, all of it. It is all electricity, 100%. So obviously, we got over our fears and decided to embrace electricity. And Kearney is going to end up doing the exact same thing. They basically realize that the developments that are going on in the bigger cities, they also want to try and implement them here, because Kearney was seen as a very favorable area for a lot of people. It's right on the railroad, on multiple railroad lines. It is pretty much centrally located in the country, and it's right on the Platte River, which is beneficial for irrigation and a lot of farming communities and things like that. So Kearney becomes an incorporated official city in 1873, and again, becomes kind of this generally favorable area because it's flat, has a lot of space and things like that. And then in 1876, the very same year that this map was drawn and published, they start talking of putting in, okay, we got all these cities and people living here, but we have all these farms that are forming out here as well. So we need to get irrigated water to them. We got to get water to them somehow. And so they basically come up with this conceptual design of a large irrigation system network. And they start to wonder, okay, well, where are we going to get it from? And then they realize pretty quickly that they can literally get it right from the Platte River. That is right next door, basically right on the Platte River here. Early investors in a lot of the newspaper articles and a lot of the incentivizing promotional talk that they tried to do to get this, there are literally some investors who wanted irrigation who said that the Platte River was wasting its potential energy simply meandering the plains. What a big lazy river, you know, like just sitting out there, just meandering along, not doing work for us. So they decided, you know what, we should harness this if we can and make it work for us, is the kind of general idea at the time. This is eons before anything like environmental protection is in anybody's head, or what the effects of environmental, like when you start carving into and rerouting the natural formation of our world around us, it can have long-term terrible effects. But this is long before any of that, and people just saw this as kind of an infinite source of water for a very long time. And it was, you know, as the old saying is like, the Platte River is an inch deep and a mile wide. So they really didn't think that they were, like, it was gonna have a huge impact. So they pretty quickly pushed it through the Nebraska State Legislature, the first irrigation law of Nebraska, or also known as the first right of eminent domain for water, which basically means that the government now has the ability to control, all water rights in the state for the benefit of the people. So now there's nothing standing in their way. They can start going in and rerouting all this water however they need to. And so governments and city officials and investors realize they now have a source for hydroelectric power, a seemingly infinite source of hydroelectric power. Hydroelectric power has been around forever. It's been around for a very long time. The earliest forms we like to think of are these kind of water wheels, where you literally build like a mill or your home, whatever you needed. A lot of times it would, on the inside there'd be a pole and it would turn various things that you needed, just whatever mechanisms you needed to have motion for. And then you put it on a river and the river would flow through and then it would turn and that would create motion. That would basically be, you don't have to do the effort, you let the water do the effort for you. The only thing with this is there's no electrical component, obviously. and it can only power as much as the water can move. So if the water ever dries up or decides to not flow very much, you're kind of out of luck, basically. And so they decided to, started thinking okay, let's start to see if we can, this new electricity that we've got, let's see if we can apply it to this. And maybe we can use it this can become something to generate electricity that can then build up and create more power. Basically the thought process behind it. So the United States decides we are going to build our own hydroelectric power plant, the very first one in the United States. And wait for it, because I have a picture of it and you're not ready. It's pretty, I don't want to spoil the surprise, so I'll just, but the very first hydroelectric power plant, I give you, ta-da, is that just kind of, okay. But this is the very first hydroelectric power plant in the United States. This is the front door. It's basically a glorified kind of outhouse, is what it looks like. But, or just a depot or something like that. But this is the Vulcan Street Hydroelectric Power Station in Wisconsin and was built in 1882. So we're talking right after Kearney becomes an incorporated city. We're talking less than 10 years. The United States now has hydroelectric power. Here's kind of a photograph of the inside of it. So basically the water there's a, dug down in here, there is a generator situated underneath, and there's water nearby that flows, and that powers this generator down here. You can only see about half moon of it right there. But it powers these pulleys, and these pulleys can then build up more and more energy. The electricity can give it the extra oomph that it needs to build up more power. And so this is basically the inside of it. It's a very simple one. This was basically used just for powering one person's, one business is all it was used for. And it was actually very experimental at the time as well. And so if you've ever wondered how does hydroelectric power work, I have just a short video I want to show you, if it'll load. Checked it last night, said it was going to, so we'll see. Ooh. The irony here is the electricity that I'm using is not cooperating. That's kind of the big irony right here. Okay, well, for some reason it's not working. I promise I tested it this morning and on a different machine and it worked. But basically, it just illustrates that hydroelectric power basically, basically you have to reroute the water to go where you want it to. Typically it's slowly routing it up and then having it come down something so that it gains momentum and then goes down and turns a generator. Basically, it turns like a big fan wheel underground, which then generates power. And then the generator, you can then hook it up to all kinds of different stuff, and I was like, that was kind of a clip of it, but it's just, for some reason, it doesn't want to work. I apologize for that. But, so, Kearney very quickly gets on this kind of train of wanting to implement hydroelectric power. So we build our own powerhouse here in Kearney. And so this is the original powerhouse. This photo was taken in 1893 by local photographer A.T. Anderson. And this one was built in 1886. The very first one, I mean, look at the comparison. Take that, Wisconsin, you know, like, and so this one, it's 3 stories, and it's definitely quite a step up from the very first one. And this one's built in 1886, this one's built in 1882, so we're talking 4 years of difference here. That there's all of a sudden a whole new, basically the powerhouses are gaining power, basically. And so this plant also utilizes the exact same principles of water, and it is the very first hydroelectric power plant in the entire state of Nebraska. And so the solution, so they basically are like, okay, well, we have this power plant, how are we going to utilize the Platte River to get water to it? And the solution ends up being pretty simple. It's build a canal. Build a canal system to route the water from the Platte River up to the power plant. Just bring the water to you and then manipulate the flow of the water along the way in certain ways that it gains momentum, so when it actually gets to the power plant, it has a lot of rushing force behind it, basically, to be able to power multiple generators. And so the city basically, in 1881, so years before they even start building the power plant, they decide they want one. And so they're like, okay, we have to be able to get the water there first and make sure we can do that first. Because if we build the power plant and can't get the water there, then the whole thing is kind of moot, basically. And so April 2nd, 1881, the Kearney Board of Trade was established, and then they formed the Kearney Canal and Water Supply Company. They estimated the total cost for the canal to be about $21,448, which is about $680,000 in today's money. That does not seem like a lot of money to me for such a huge invested project. But then in April 1882, the very next year, the City of Kearney votes and is offered a vote to approve bonds with tax money for $30,000, so hopefully to cover this and any other additional expenses that might come up, which is nearly $1 million in today's money. Just shy of $1 million, about $950,000 to complete the canal. It would be $5,000 for the very first mile, so $160,000 in today's money, and then $2,000 for each additional mile after that. So construction begins in 1882 after that bond for $30,000 passes, and the goal is to make it 16 miles long, 4 feet deep, and 25 feet wide at the top, from one edge of the canal to the opposite edge. They built it with a very slight slope, then they would slightly reroute the slopes to get the water to actually gain momentum as it went along. They planned it all out and all this stuff. Unfortunately, to try and direct the water flow and have that water kind of gain momentum as it went along. But unfortunately, construction had to stop in 1884 because the funding dried up, and the city voted not to continue funding it because it'd been 2 years by this point, 2 years by this point, and they still had not seen the actual completion of the canal, or they still didn't have any electricity. So they're like, we're paying for it with our taxes, but we aren't still seeing any results. And human beings, I love human beings, but the one thing that a lot of us are very impatient people, and we like to, it's hard for us to think of like the long term and things like that in some cases. And so especially when you're paying for it out of your own tax money, you like to kind of hopefully see some results. And at this point, they really aren't seeing any results. So the city decided not to, they put it up for another vote to increase funding. They said, we've already done $30,000, which is more than you estimated anyway, still not there. And so construction basically comes to a halt. And it looks like that the canal is just never gonna get finished. It's just gonna overgrow, or they're gonna fill it in and just be done with it. But at that time, one person has decided that he's going to move to the city of Kearney. He's been looking for an area to move to and an area to live in, and decides that Kearney is going to be a great place. And one thing that he absolutely wants for the future of any city that he lives in is electric power. And so George Washington Frank, who is the namesake for our G.W. Frank Museum of History and Culture, he steps in and decides to continue funding the canal, basically. He has family money, he has investors, he has a great vision and this big electrical vision and plan for Kearney, and so he moves to Kearney in the mid-1880s, He wants to build his home here, but he wants that home to have electricity, so he's got to build a power plant, because you can't have, you know, if you're going to have a house with electricity, you got to build a power plant. And so he's like, okay, well, most of the work is done. The initial kind of planning and work and the initial parts of the canal are done. So this actually won't be too bad. So I will go ahead and work on basically spearheading the funding for the rest of this canal. He basically takes over that Kearney Canal and Water Supply Company, becomes the owner by 4/5 majority, and then partly also establishes the George Frank Improvement Company and ties it into this company, uses all of that to eventually complete the canal. And so he funds the remaining work on the canal, and it is completed in 1886. And he is the president of this company from 1889 until 1896. And so Kearney is all excited about this because one, they don't have to pay for it, and two, they basically are saying like, woo, we're actually gonna have electricity here pretty soon. So a lot of people are excited about George Frank and his investment and prospects and all these things, and so they publish in the paper almost every single day some update on the canal or the hydroelectric plant or something to that effect. And basically say, you know, George W. Frank Improvement Company, it is the intention to continue the work until its present vast power is greatly increased, so much so as to make sufficient power for Kearney's use when our population reaches its 100,000 mark. Kearney's never had 100,000 people in it, but it's ambitious, you know, we could still someday have 100,000 people, but they foresaw that, they understood that having electricity meant huge opportunities and options and things, and making Kearney a very attractive place to move to and that kind of stuff. So basically, and then it goes on to say, the fall is very great in our city, and the present supply of water will run the electric power, the cotton mill, and the great number of other new enterprises that are come to us. But the George Frank Improvement Company proposes to be prepared for any future call for power for years to come. So the focus of the George Frank Improvement Company is electric power. They realize once you have that, you can do just about anything else. One of the other kind of fun side notes that George Frank had for the idea for the canal is not just for power and industry, but also for fun. And so he had this idea. Mr. George Frank is talking of placing a gondola on the canal for use of pleasure parties. If this is done, it is proposed to operate it by electricity, stringing an overhead wire along the canal to the head gates. A trip to the head gates and return 25 miles would be a very enjoyable one, and if the boat is put on there, it is no doubt will be well patronized. So they had all this like, excitement and hope, and like, let's put boats on the canal and have fun in the canal and all this kind of stuff. They were really making the canal part of their own identity and own kind of future focus and things like that. So then the canal does eventually expand. Later on in 1894, the Kearney votes on the canal again, which approves expansion and additional funding of $60,000 this time, twice as much, or about $1.2 million in today's money. They increase the depth of the canal from 4 feet to 9 feet, and then the width from 25 to 35 feet across. The idea is more water flowing means more power. More water, more power. And so the final total cost of the expansion ends up being about $115,000, so definitely a little bit above that original $60,000, or about $4.3 million today. And so in total, the canal ends up costing from start to finish about $145,000, or about $5.3 million today. But it's all worth it, because the whole point is to get the power plant up and running. It was all worth it because that's the whole point. You can't do all you can't make the canal do anything unless it goes to a power source. And so they build the power plant right on the same year that the canal is completed. It's made of brick. It's 3 stories or 62 feet tall. In 1887, it generated electricity for public consumption and use for the very first time. Problem is nobody has any light bulbs or electrical wires, because electricity is brand new. But they do start implementing it very slowly. So it's ready to go once people, if anybody has a light switch or a light bulb in their house, we're ready to power it kind of thing. So it's slowly kind of like, it's like the power plant came kind of a little bit cart before the horse, a little bit. But still, doesn't take long for people to start implementing. And then the very first wheel turbine inside the hydroelectric power plant can actually generated 366 horsepower. This whole giant building, 366 horsepower. The equivalent of a speedboat engine today. That is the equivalent, that is 350 horsepower right there. That's 350 horsepower. So, again, this is the very early stages of this stuff. Obviously, they're not gonna go, like the kind of power we know today, because it has to start somewhere. It's gotta start somewhere. So, at its peak, eventually it grows to 2,725 horsepower in its peak years, which is about the average engine power of a large personal truck today. So still not a ton, but enough. It actually generates electricity, and it's a success. It is seen as a success because it works. And so they basically, this is just a photo of them bringing down the water around so that they can redirect. They've directed all the canal all through the city, and it's going to come up here and then rush down here. You can see some of the water here. Rush down here and into the generator and turn that generator is the idea. And if it looks familiar, it's because this is the location of it today, which is just north of UNK's campus, just basically right north of the College of Education or the Health and Sports Center, kind of right by the Cope Stadium, kind of in that area. And so here's another view of it with the actual power plant next to that spillway. And so as you can tell, the original power plant's not there anymore, obviously, but as obvious by the photos, but the spillway is definitely still there. So the water reroutes up here and then goes down here, it gains tons of momentum and goes through here and basically turns a generator, is basically what it does. And so by the later 1880s, 1887, Kearney now boasts that it has 8-hole arc lamps, which is basically a very early light bulb. This is an interior shot. You can see how gigantic those are compared to that one in Wisconsin, where it's just kind of the smaller wheels and stuff. But these giant wheels, there's one of the workers there for scale. But all of this to power just a few lamps. And so Kearney literally published it everywhere. I looked everywhere and could not find the actual, I've seen it, I know I've seen it, of an actual newspaper article that states like 8 light bulbs in Kearney, and they were all excited about it and stuff. 8 arc lamps that now have continuous, reliable power. That's kind of the big caveat to consider as well, is it's not just that they have power, but it's now reliable and continuous, which is a big deal. So arc lamps basically are an early form of light bulbs. Here's some examples of some arc lamps. Basically what it is, it's like a wire that arcs in here, and then the power comes in one, it kind of zips around between the two, and then goes out this way, and then it lights up the glass bulb, basically. So early light bulbs, basically. And so by the early 1890s, though, there were over 3,000 electric light bulbs in Kearney. So people are very excited about electricity and got on board with it, and they all were like, yes, everybody put light bulbs in everything. It's very exciting. And then also, but to power those in your home, you can't just have them on continuously. So the very first power switches, things that we think of like light switches, like there's one right there, you can't see that one, sorry, but there's like light switches, you know. So this is one of the very earliest and oldest in-home power switches in Kearney, Nebraska, and it's actually right here on the table. So if anybody after the talk wants to come up and take a look, you're welcome to touch it. You can flip it back and forth if you want. This was one light switch for one home. And the one home that it was in was, of course, the owner of the Canal and Waterpower company. And so he gets the very first, pretty much, to our knowledge, the very first in-home, private, domestic light switch, basically. And this is a photo in about 1889, right around there, 1890. of what is now the Frank Museum, the GW Frank Museum on campus. So this was George Frank's house. So he built it, or he contracted his son, George William Frank Jr., who was an architect, to build the house. And his son built it not only to reflect like the family's opulence, but he also built it with the idea of, we want electricity in this house because it needs to be an example for the future of Kearney. And so this is one of my very favorite photos from 1893 of the original house when the Franks still lived here, because this is the dining room. And so you have this like beautiful dining room with all these details, and like, it's just pure Victorian era, over encumbered, over detailed, just awesomeness. And then, but just then you have all this, and then just right in the middle of the room, there's just 3 light bulbs hanging on a wire, like right in the center of this beautiful dining room. And there's a kind of a blown up shot of it, just these 3 light bulbs, 3 arc lamps, basically, little early arc lamps, and just hanging in the middle of the room. And it's because they wanted to showcase that they had electricity. So again, it's one of those things where we take it for granted, but they literally would invite investors or friends over, and they could all just sit and stare at the light bulbs and be just totally impressed. So it catches on, and pretty much power wasn't just for lights, it then becomes implemented for like all other industries, and Kearney kind of goes through its own industrial revolution. George Frank now has the canal and the power plant under his jurisdiction, basically. And so he uses that to start generating power for all other kinds of stuff. So he builds all these different businesses as this vision for Kearney. So he builds the cotton mill. There used to be a huge cotton mill out at Cotton Mill Park that was operated and powered by the hydroelectric power plant. So here's the interior of it. At one time it boasted having over 15,000 spindles. That seems like a lot to me. But it was probably closer to 1,500, but a lot of exaggeration was allowed at this time for boosterism and that kind of stuff. Plus, there's really no way to fact check a lot of this stuff at the time. So a lot of people got, embellished a bit. But was 89,000 square feet, and total cost would be $400,000 to build, or about $12.6 million today. But every single one of these spindles is powered by electricity from that, like, 366 horsepower at the hydroelectric power plant. They also had a brick company, a paper mill, they even had an ice factory, all kinds of different things. These were all powered by electricity. Every single one of them was eventually either powered by or had the goal in mind to be fully powered with electricity. But probably one of the most interesting businesses that they come up with is the trolley cars. These electric street cars that go through the city, basically. And I really wish these were still here. That would be the coolest thing. If, so if Kearney ever gets a big investor with money that they don't know what to do with, this could be a really cool idea for some public transportation. So Kearney has some of the very earliest electric streetcars in the whole country. And so in the late 1800s, the streetcars the railways are built, and then the streetcars are installed on a 5.5-mile route of electric roads, is what they keep referring to them in all these newspaper articles and things, electric roads. And by January 25th, 1889, the Electric Railway Company in Kearney is officially incorporated and becomes an official company. And so, and they are all powered, again, by these wires that are attached and go right into the power plant. And as you can see right down here in this photo, that original photo, there's a little streetcar peeking out right there. He's about ready to leave and head downtown, because the route goes up and down Central Avenue through downtown, and then basically from campus to East Lawn, the mobile home park here in town. And so this is a photograph of 1886, before the streetcars are put in, of Central Avenue. You can actually see one of the very first arc lamps. That's one of those 8 arc lamps right there, early in Kearney. So they're starting, you can see telegraph poles are in and stuff. So electricity's coming, it's here, but they just haven't quite gotten around to doing the streetcars yet. So just a few years later though, by 1889, just almost into 1890, you can see the streetcars are officially implemented. And I always like this photo because it's a good example of how things transition. because you have electrified streetcar right alongside the original, like the old horse and buggy carriage that had been implemented for thousands of years in humanity. So it's a really good photo that kind of shows that, but it shows like there's tons of wires and electricity now, and of course one of the original arc lamps still up there. And so, sorry, this is a little tough to read, but as the streetcars were getting built and stuff, if they were excited about the canal, they were overly excited about this electric. You can just tell Kearney is so excited to have streetcars. They're so excited. And they, electric streetcars and stuff. So the Kearney Hub, the Kearney Daily Hub is posting in the paper almost every day with updates and stuff. So it's like at 3 p.m. this afternoon, the following brief but important telegram was received by the hub. Like they're telling people in real time, like, we got it, we received a telegram at 3 p.m. that says the Electric Street Railroad contract has been definitively closed with the Thompson Houston Company, and work will be commenced within 30 days. So they're updating people in real time. And then also more like op-ed pieces about like the electric road coming in. So this is July 3rd, the day before July 4th. It outlines how the rails will save time, will accommodate summer travelers, and that new electrical cars will have a top exciting speed of 12 miles per hour, which is just mind-blowing. And they're advertising it, so they're gonna be like, it's thrilling. It's a thrilling time to be alive, basically. And so again, here's another photo, another kind of angle of that with the streetcars, and then here's the line down the middle, and that one of those original arc lamps, you can see with the little bulb and the two lines, and they had 6 cars to start. And so 6 of these electric cars, and they went with what's known as the trolley car design. And so the trolley car design, the reason they're called this is because this is the trolley. This mechanism right here, this right here that connects up here, this is the trolley. And it comes from an Old English word of trawl, spelled like troll, meaning to roll or trundle along. And so here's kind of the inner workings of it and how it powers, because it goes through here and then works its way through here to actually connect to the metal rails down here. And so here's the trolley, there's the trolley, and then it goes through and connects to the bottom, which then the wheels touch are powered by the electricity and are able to move. And so if we overlay our original photo, superimpose it on top, kind of gives you an idea of what our trolley cars, how they work. It goes through here, down through here, and powers the wheels so they can move. And it's all powered by these wires that go all the way back to the hydroelectric power company. So these trolley cars, again, here's the trolley here, you can see kind of a little bit, but there's the trolley wire up to the main wire here in Kearney. So there's a wire up here that goes all the way back to the hydroelectric power plant. They eventually grew so popular that even Lincoln and Omaha will install their own lines for this. They don't operate anymore either, but Kearney was the very first. We actually were first before San Francisco had their very famous streetcars as well. So all of this together basically means that Kearney is now a very electric city. By the early 1890s, electricity will power everything from, quote, lights to dentist drills, to downtown stores, to over 15,000 spindles at the cotton mill, according to one report. The average cost for the electricity in 1880 was 16 cents per kilowatt hour, which is $5 in today's money, meaning if the average household uses about 900 kilowatts of power today, if it was still $5, you would be spending $4,500 a month for electricity. Today, it's about 13.7 cents in today's dollars, in today's cents. If it was still $5, so obviously at the beginning, it's very, very expensive, but that's just how it is with anything that's kind of rare and new. By 1890, it drops to 10 cents, which is about $3 in today's dollars, so you'd only be paying $2,700 a month in today's money. Totally affordable. But luckily it drops to, now that once something becomes very widespread, it's no longer rare and like very valuable, so it becomes much less expensive. Here's an advertisement or billing card for the original Kearney Electric Light and Power Company. that talks about how additional lamps are 15 cents per month. You gotta pay 15 cents per month, and again, that is about $4,000 a month if you want another. So only the very wealthy people at the beginning and the wealthy businesses could really afford this, or if you owned the company, you could get it for free. So George Frank was able to get a lot of this in his implementation. And so it really seemed like everything was like, you know, no pun intended, but very bright and promising. But then there's a giant panic of 1893 collapse, where a large countrywide financial collapse known as the Panic of 1893, the population of Kearney drops. George Frank's businesses begin to close. Streets cars are eventually decommissioned in 1895, and the wooden railroad ties are actually all pulled up and sold or given to local farmers as fence posts. So it's very possible there are fences around here that still have original wooden ties. So if you're ever driving around and see like a fence post that looks like it could be a railroad tie, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to check it out. But 1901, then that big cotton mill, which was a big promising industry, it closes. And then by the early 1900s, the George Frank Improvement Company loses ownership of the canal and the power plant. And then worse, in the 1920s, just a few years after this, the power plant itself collapses, ironically, from the water eroding out underneath of it. Again, this is before people really understood like environmental impact, so they just built and like did stuff and then waited for disaster. Nowadays, like we very much plan and test areas and things like that, but basically it falls down. And so it kind of seems like, dang, this one like real big electric vision is like, it all, the canal is shut down, the power plants collapse, the street cars are gone, everything's just terrible. But the implementation of electricity and all the money that was put into Kearney actually does help carry it through that panic of 1893. And then in the just a few years after the turn of the century, there's this talk that starts up again of like, we really need to like refocus on getting electricity because we cannot get back going again until we have power to do that. So in 1920, only 5% of rural Nebraska farms had electricity, compared to over 60% in some of the more metro areas. So only 5% of rural Nebraska had electricity. During the Roaring 20s and into the Great Depression that followed, they would eventually start turning their attention to regional development and putting money into cities to get them working again after the Great Depression, because just within about 40 years after that big panic of 1893, there's another big economic collapse. And so in the 1930s, during the New Deal era that followed the Great Depression, the Consumers Public Power District is formed. It's the first large statewide power entity to really start looking at this stuff. They purchased the Kearney Canal and the power plant, and today it is now known as the Nebraska Public Power District, or NPPD. NPPD powers my house. It does. And so we can, like, again, you can start to feel like connected to this history and stuff. Connected, that's a big pun, I just realized. But it's been great. There's so many electricity puns, it's pretty great. But this was formed in 1970. 1970 is when it switched over to NPPD. And so they do own and operate the canal and the spillway that still has water running down it even today. If you drive by it today, there will be water running down it. And this is just some Google Street images of the kind of industrialization that's been built up around it. So you can see like the little spire right back there, and the spillway is going to be right here, and then this is the Health and Sports Center, and then right behind us over here is the Coke Stadium, basically. But it's all industrialized, so it still provides about 5% of the power to the entire city today. And across the state, NPPD provides electricity to almost 1 million Nebraskans in 91 of our 93 counties. 60% of that comes from coal, 20% still comes from hydroelectric power throughout the state, and then 20% comes from nuclear power. There are 3 nuclear stations currently in the state, or there's only one that actually operates, but there have been 3 in the state of Nebraska. One was in Brownville, Nebraska, and that's the one that is still operating, so still providing nuclear power. Another one was Blair, Nebraska, Fort Calhoun, shut down in 2016, and then the Hallam nuclear power plant that shut down in 1964, a year after it opened. So 64 was still a very experimental year for nuclear power, but But with all that in mind, since 1949, Nebraska is the only state in the entire United States where our power is 100% owned by us. We own our own power. And in 1936, this is because in 1936, Nebraska State Senator at the time, George Norris, wrote to pass the Rural Electrification Act, and Nebraska has had 0 for-profit electric companies since. This is why Nebraska has some of the cheapest electricity rates in the whole United States. We are the 5th cheapest in the whole United States, at 11.8 cents per kilowatt hour. This varies though, kind of back and forth. It's closer to about 13 cents right now, 13 cents. But Hawaii is the most expensive, if anybody's curious. But so a little bit about just George Norris. He was senator from 1912 to 1942, very long tenure. He was the primary senator for that Rural Electrification Act and the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was part of that New Deal administration, to go around and develop a lot of regional and rural areas. He understood that wealthy electric company owners should not have access to all the power and control it, because many of them did not care about helping the poor farmers in the area. And so he decided to introduce first the laws where the people have a right, like it's an actual right to have electrical power. And he ends up passing the REA, the Rural Electrification Act. And then because of his work in 1961, he's actually the very first person inducted into the Nebraska Hall of Fame. So here's a photo of him with FDR signing the Rural Electrification Act. There's George Norris right there. And even FDR himself has said the forward march of electric cooperatives has an even more profound significance in terms of our fight to preserve democracy. Meaning that in order to have a thriving democracy, you have to have thriving electricity. It just is how it is, basically. So today, Nebraska has over 27,000 miles of electric lines, enough to go from New York to Los Angeles 10 times. And even today, the power plant still provides the power. Here's the original canal. The canal also goes this way, but the water comes this way and then goes down the spillway, this little triangle shape here. There's that spire, all that industrialized area goes down here and out this way. And so the canal does still serve its original purpose in some ways, but as we know, the canal has now been opened up for entertainment and recreation and things like that. So here's a map of the canal. This is 11th Street up here. Down here, it kind of goes down here, and yeah, even today. So here's an original photo of just below the spillway of the canal. And today, it's used for a lot of recreation. So that original kind of plan by Mr. Fun-loving George Frank really kind of ended up happening a little bit. I always wonder what he'd think of people using the canal for fun in this way. So basically that's kind of the history of how we go from this, start here, and go all the way to this is a more current map of Kearney from 2022. And so just to put it a little in perspective, to compare the two, that little rectangle right there, the little purple rectangle, is basically that purple rectangle there. So you can see Kearney has definitely expanded out from beyond this original map. And it was all because of electricity, all of it. So now today, Kearney is very much an electric city, and all of it's possible because of this, electric vision that came about basically almost 150 years ago. And so now we definitely get to thrive in and enjoy a lot of the electricity that was put forth a while ago. For me personally, I'm very grateful for the efforts that were made back then. The pitfalls, even despite all of the roadblocks and times it seemed like it was done, like when they ran out of funding, and then the Panic of 1893, and then the Great Depression. It was just like human beings have this unique ability to rise to meet occasions and figure out problems when we need to. We really do. And it ends up paying off in big ways. So that is all I have for you. So thank you all so much for listening. So does anyone have any questions on anything?
Where did the cars go to when the trolley cars? Do you have any idea?
The trolley cars, that's a great question. So the question was, where did the trolley cars go? when, you know, those giant trolley cars. The short answer is we aren't 100% sure. They kind of just, a lot of them were taken apart for scrap metal. There's actually one, at Trails and Rails Museum, there's one of the rear view mirrors, because although these were electric, they still had a person kind of driving and steering and monitoring. And so there were still rear view mirrors for them to be able to look at the passengers and stuff behind them in the car. There's one mirror that like is from one of the street cars at Trails and Rails. That's the only physical evidence we have that these trolley cars even existed beyond the photos. But I've heard multiple stories, like some of them were taken out to Lake McConaughey and thrown in the water to create habitats for fish. I've heard that. I've also heard that they were kind of just taken apart and scrapped for scrap metal and things like that. And a lot of the copper wiring in them was valuable, so they took that out. But yeah, to answer your question, unfortunately, I don't really know. I would love to know, but.
Do you know, or where would I find out, what would be the voltage that they were sending out?
Good question. I know that it produced 366 horsepower, so I'm guessing it would just be a question of like trying to convert that to voltage, but I'm not sure.
It would depend on amperage too then.
What's that? I'm sorry?
You use voltage and amperage to come up with horsepower.
Yeah.
But you need to know one to get the other.
Right, and I would say it would be comparing it to like other similar hydroelectric. So if we don't have the actual information in our records, then it might just be comparing it to other similar ones of the time period. I'm guessing to try and figure that out, but yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure. Yeah.
You mentioned coal. Two questions. Where does the coal come from? And where in Nebraska are the power plants that use the coal?
That's a very good question, and the answer to both, unfortunately, is I don't know. I do know that a lot of the coal is imported. I don't know if anybody here knows where the coal might be coming from.
Wyoming.
Wyoming? Is that where is that?
Gillette, Wyoming.
Okay, so Wyoming, I guess, is the big source of a lot of our coal here, where a lot of the coal mines are. And then the actual power plants that operate using coal in the state of Nebraska, I am not 100% sure on. Omaha has one. Omaha definitely has one. Sutherland, Grand Island, so a few different places, yeah. Thank you all for helping. Appreciate it.
I moved here in the 1960s, and I was told that some trolley cars were dumped in what is now is Kearney Lake.
Mhm.
And rumored to that is one question. The second would be, I was also told that the earliest water rights to the Platte River is that power plant you were showing.
Mhm. Yep.
Are either of those true?
I do know that one of I had also heard that some of the street cars had been dumped into Kearney Lake. The thing is the lake has been emptied several times and there's nothing in it. So either it was disintegrated, or they were in there at one point and they removed them, or they were never actually in there, or they talked about doing it. Or possibly. It's possible, yeah. There's a lot of different. Unfortunately, we haven't had a chance to go and actually archaeological explore a lot of the areas and stuff, which would be fun. But we just haven't had a chance to do that. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm not 100% sure, but I have heard that story for sure.
How about the water rights?
And then the water rights, I know that in 1877 was the first kind of legislative act for water rights, and I know that the hydroelectric power plant was counting on that passing, because they would not have been able to like reroute the Platte River and build the canal and stuff and up to the hydroelectric power plant if that legislation had not passed. So I know there's like reliant connection, but I'm not sure if it was the very first one or not.
I think, I'm not for sure, I think the Kearney Canal is famous if you take water law, like at Golden, Golden, Colorado. I know this because my brother-in-law, when they study water law, the Kearney Canal is one of the very first things and most important water law cases in the country.
Mm-hmm.
But on the Platte, it has the second rights. I think the first rights comes to the creek. I could be wrong, if anybody's from NPPD did it.
Yes, there are disputes on like the original rights of where the water's allowed to be routed and stuff. And I know Crete and Kearney did get into it in the 1800s and had kind of like some animosity there as a result. But yeah, and I also know that even right now, there's like, issues going on between Colorado and how it's using the plat. I haven't got a chance to really look into it, but I've heard a little bit about it and stuff. And I know that even today, the right to water is still a highly, like, important issue.
And in Colorado, you own the water. You can own the land, but you can't own the water. Somebody
Right.
else can own the water.
Anyone else have any last questions? Otherwise, like I said, feel free, you can check out the very first power switch that we know of in a domestic home. Up here, I also have some photos up here from the interior of the hydroelectric power plant, some more photos that you can look at up close if you like. Otherwise, I'll be here if anybody has any more questions. So thank you all so much. Thank you.